hoping he's going to share with us some insights from his new book, which I'm sure are very relevant to these times now. So just a very brief overview of Clem and some of his backgrounds. He was born in England and he studied politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford. And then he moved to Africa in the early 1970s, and he came out with Anglo Gold. He ended up being the CEO of Anglo's gold and uranium division, which at the time, in the good old days of Joburg gold mining, was the largest gold mining or mine in the world. And then eventually he moved on to scenario planning, where he started scenario planning with Anglo and worked with many other large corporates, such as Royal Dutch Shell. And he's probably most well known, in my view, for the early 1990s, when he had discussions with F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela, and he started developing some scenarios for the new South Africa. Obviously, the low road, which was based on conflict, civil war, and South Africa becoming a wasteland, and the high road, which thankfully we seem to take, which was negotiation, political settlement, and a very prosperous future for South Africa. And I really do think that now in South Africa, we are perhaps at a little bit of a crossroad where it's really relevant right now to have a look at, where are we at as a country and as a nation? What are the different scenarios and how do we understand them? So Clem, I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, so most of the listeners, and I hope that you're going to share with us some of your views and some insights from your new book, which is called Thinking the Future from the Shoulders of Giants. And we're going to give a couple of copies of the book away, which we will get. So we'll talk about that at the end, and we will make some time for questions. So if you do have any questions, please put them on the message group, and we will do our best to answer all of them towards the end. So Clem, thank you so much for joining. I too, our team members, our family members, and all of our brokers, and we're looking forward to listening to you.
Thanks so much, Justin. Good morning, everybody. I do want to just show the book, Thinking the Future, and I wrote it with a young man called Mitch Ilbury. And I'm proud to say it's been out since the beginning of July. It was published by Penguin. And this last weekend, it was #1 on in the business planning and forecasting section of Amazon Books. So it's already done pretty well. And I'd like to just go through a bit of the methodology that we outline in the book by looking at several giants who have in the past helped us think about the future. And then I want to move on to what's going on in the world at the moment by looking at some of the flags that are changing the global economy even before the pandemic started. I then like to look at South Africa and talk about the scenarios we have in this book for the future of South Africa. And yeah, then you can ask me questions. The story starts really in 1960 when a researcher at Rand Corporation called Herman Kahn decided to write a book which he called On Thermonuclear War. He was an advisor to the US Defense Forces, and he decided to show what could happen if there was a flat-out nuclear conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. And the book was an incredible success, and sold many copies. But the point of the book was that he wasn't trying to forecast it was going to happen. He was showing people what would happen if the two sides came into conflict. And he called it scenario planning because he was closely associated with several Hollywood producers. And if you remember, they call the summary of a movie script a scenario when they peddle it around to try and raise money. And he decided to link scenario with the word planning, call it scenario planning. And this started a whole new methodology for looking at the future. It was very lucky he wrote it in 1960 because 2 years later, the scenario very nearly turned into reality with the Cuban Missile Crisis when the Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba and the Americans weren't having anything to do with that. And Khrushchev and Kennedy very nearly came to blows. And indeed, I think that this helped actually resolve the situation, because it showed how terrible a war between the two countries would be. Overnight, Herman Kahn became quite famous. And one of my mentors, Pierre Wack, he was a Frenchman, and he's one of the giants that we feature in this book. He studied under Herman Kahn and then became head of scenario planning at Royal Dutch Shell. And he actually, in the 1970s, produced scenarios of oil price shocks for the Shell management. The first one they didn't listen to, but the second one in the mid-70s, they really did, and they stocked up on oil, and they changed their management practices. And then the oil price shot up from about $12 a barrel to $40 a barrel. And Shell made a fortune. And Pierre became a legend in London, because that was where he was based with his scenario team for Shell. And our company, Anglo-American, was at the time the largest mining company in the world. And we thought, if you could do it for oil, perhaps you can do it for minerals and gold and diamonds as well. So we knew Pierre was retiring from Shell at the beginning of the 1980s. So we asked him to come to Johannesburg and give our executive committee a presentation, which he did. And he totally bewitched us, because not only did he give a good talk, he looked like a futurist. He had a goatee beard, he had hooded eyes, it was just this whole presentation which just blew us away. And the chairman of the meeting looked at me. I was the secretary of the Anglo executive at the time, and said, would you take on the function of scenario planning inside our company? And Pierre was immediately hired as a consultant. And so I had this incredible period of 10 years with Pierre, learning about scenario planning and how you should look at the future. Unfortunately, Pierre retired in the early 90s, and the whole methodology in Anglo-American started dying down. And it was only in the year 2000, when I read a thesis by a young woman called Chantal Ilbury, that I thought of a way of reviving it, because she'd written her thesis on scenario planning for small business. And so we collaborated on a book, which we published in June 2001, called The Mind of a Fox. And the whole point of the title was to use a metaphor which had been used by a Greek poet called Archilochus, who said, the hedgehog knows one big thing, whereas the fox knows many little things. And we said forecasters are very much in that hedgehog bracket, whereas scenario planners who look at multiple futures are very much foxes. And it was a huge success. And indeed, we had a letter to George Bush in the book, in which we said that one of his scenarios was a massive terrorist strike on a Western city. And it happened 3 months after we published the book, with 9/11. And so, you know, we became instantly popular overseas with this methodology. And what we've tried to do in thinking the future is to actually look at the big philosophers like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and the Stoics that are behind the kind of thinking that we now use. Because we believe that you shouldn't try and forecast the future in these highly uncertain times. I mean, there's a book that's very popular around the world called Super Forecasting, which basically says, you know, you can forecast the future in a kind of nuanced way and apply probabilities. And Philip Tetlock, who's one of the authors of the book, actually uses the hedgehog fox analogy in the book. Whether he got it from us, I don't know. But we wanted to contrast his approach with our approach, which is it's much more important getting to know the forces that are driving the present into the future and then seeing the possible ways that those forces can lead. And one of the most important things along the way is to look at the flags which would suggest that a particular future is coming into play, and the probability of that particular scenario is increasing. And then, of course, as everybody knows, you can't just think the future, you've got to do something about it. And so, you know, we say once the flags are going up and the probabilities are changing, how are you going to adapt your strategy going forward? Because it's a dynamic process. Thinking the future is something you've got to do 24/7 every day, because every day something new happens. And obviously last week was a total shock for South Africans, but now you've got to feature it in any scenarios and flags that you might have moving forward. So what are the flags that we had in our minds when we talked to both local and international clients, even before the pandemic started? Well, number one was the religious flag. It's still there, unfortunately. It creates waves in the Middle East. Two things: we had that recent war between Israel and Palestinian movements, and it shows that situation hasn't gone away, and it has to be constantly watched. And the other big flag at the moment is the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. You know, they've said they're going to have all troops out by the end of this year, and the Taliban are making advances throughout Afghanistan. And so you sort of say to yourself, you know, what's going to happen now? And what are the possible sources of conflict? And then you have the ongoing rivalry between Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other hand. And of course, there's a lot of worry about Iran eventually developing nuclear weapons. So it's a flag you have to constantly watch, because it can affect so many countries in that part of the world. And of course, you know, America may become involved at some stage with this flag. The second one we call the red flag, because it's the old communist countries, which is Russia, China, and North Korea. With Russia, we all know that Putin has a difficult relationship with Western leaders, and the point about Russia is that they think quite differently to the West. You know, they felt when they annexed Crimea that it was part of Russia, and of course now we have sanctions between Europe and Russia and America and Russia, so it's already a difficult relationship. And as we said in the previous book, Russia is a nuclear superpower, and therefore, you know, that book on thermonuclear war still, you know, has relevance today. But of course, wars are changing, and now the biggest threat is the cyber threat. You know, every day we're hearing about ransomware and a whole systems that drive companies in providing critical services and infrastructure have suddenly the whole software systems have collapsed because of cyber attacks. So war is changing in nature. And Russia is definitely featuring in that. But that brings us on to China. I mean, the incredible thing about China is that they were the 100th ranked economy in 1978. And by the end of the 2020s, they will probably be number one ahead of America. So they will have gone up 100 places in 50 years. I mean, it is extraordinary, that. And of course, it's an inconvenient truth for people in the West because they're not a democracy. It's an autocracy. And that's why, again, you have to watch now the relationship between America and China, because they are utterly different. I mean, I've done lectures on scenario planning at the Harvard Business School, but equally I've done lectures at the Central Party School in Beijing, which is the inner sanctum of the Chinese Communist Party. And you cannot believe how different they are. And these two countries are going to have to get along with one another because of another flag I'm going to talk about. And so you have to watch how the Chinese and the American presidents interact with one another, because the last thing you want is for a large conflict to develop now between America and China. And the third part of the red flag is North Korea, which its nuclear arsenal hasn't gone away. Trump very proudly announced that they'd agreed a program of denuclearization, but it hasn't happened. And it is still a big threat. And North Korea is in very desperate circumstances at the moment because of the pandemic and shortage of food. So, you know, again, one has to watch very carefully, because any threat by North Korea against South Korea will be met, obviously, again, with American resistance. The next flag that we've been watching, because it is changing the present into the future, it's one of the driving forces, is the whole flag around the anti-establishment movement in the world. The fact that social media now is such a powerful force in determining the future of the world. And of course, that has other trends associated with it, such as inequality, which has meant that you've got movements, middle class of people against the super rich, because people haven't done that well since the financial crash of 2008. And they're very angry. And that anger then gets vented on social media, and it produces Donald Trump as president. It produces Brexit in the UK and Boris Johnson. And so you're seeing a very different dynamic opening up because of the way social media has exploited this whole anti-establishment movement. The next flag is probably the most important one of all. It's the green flag of climate change. And if anything has shown that we are moving into a desperately different world, it's what's happened in Canada and what's now happening in Europe. I mean, last month in Canada, not Toronto, Vancouver and its surrounding areas in British Columbia suffered temperatures approaching 50 degrees centigrade. I mean, unbelievable for Canada. And unfortunately, one of the points of climate change is that it encourages extreme weather patterns. It's not so much the slow warming up of the world, it's the fact that you're seeing these incredible swings from drought, where, you know, people are really suffering, to extreme rainfall. And that's exactly what's happened in Europe at the moment, in Germany and Belgium. The Netherlands was prepared for it because they've always had to have dikes that protect their cities, but nowhere else in Europe has any clue on how to handle this. Least of all London, where, you know, they have also had massive floods in sort of posh suburbs like Kensington. And because people have built below their houses, this has really aggravated the impact of those floods. So it really is an issue now. And we've got to watch the relationship between America and China, because they have got to cooperate with one another to produce what we call in this book, Thinking the Future, paradise regained, that we actually do keep our planet in good shape. And it will require the cooperation of the two largest emitters of carbon emission, America and China, and also to encourage the rest of the world to come along. And the last flag is one which we have had on our thing. In fact, we included it in the letter to Bush, which is the pandemic flag, that now that we have 7.5 to 8 billion people in the world, there was always the risk that a pandemic would break out in the world. And it's a coincidence that it chose the year that it happened last century, which was in 1917, 18, 19. They had the Spanish flu. Well, we had, of course, the coronavirus in 2020. And we then produced 4 scenarios on the virus in April last year. The first one we called Much Ado About Nothing, because it was going around America, particularly in the sort of Trump camp, that actually this was just common flu and it should be allowed to just follow its course. And I never believed in the narrative of that scenario. And you saw the overwhelming of health facilities in London and health facilities in New York to see that this was a lot more than just a common flu. And of course, now just over 4 million people have died, and around about 200 million people have been infected. And yeah, it is not much ado about nothing. The second scenario is something to watch. We called it camel's straw, the straw that breaks the camel's back. Because what is happening is we're getting waves of this virus, and we're getting new variants like the beta variant from South Africa and the Delta variant from India. And it does appear that the vaccines aren't as effective in stopping people catching the virus. It does appear that the vaccines are very good at stopping people being hospitalized and obviously dying, and obviously that is the principal reason for taking the vaccines. But we're now seeing another wave. The markets have reacted. They were in very negative territory yesterday in Europe and America, and so we've got deep uncertainty around this. The governments have provided huge emergency funding around the world, but of course that's created a lot more government debt. And if indeed we see a new period of inflation because there's too much money chasing too few goods, then of course that could drive interest rates up, and we could get into the same difficulties that we saw in 2007. So the camel's straw scenario cannot be dismissed at this moment. The third scenario I've always kept as a low probability scenario. I call it Spain again. It's where the virus actually develops into a more lethal form and then kills a lot more people. And thank heavens that hasn't happened. And it would appear that all the variants so far are just more contagious. They're not more lethal. And so Spain again scenario, you've got to have it in the back of your mind, because it did happen in the Spanish flu that the virus got more lethal. But I think it's a low probability scenario. And the fourth scenario is the one that most of the world is in. We call it walking the tightrope. It's where you balance the walk across the rope between lives on the one hand, saving people's lives, and livelihoods on the other. And that's why there's so much tension and confusion around the world about what to do. In Britain, yesterday was Freedom Day. But I don't think that Britain feels free, because infections are going up again. The number of deaths are going up again. And, Boris, the Prime Minister, is back in isolation along with his Chancellor of the Exchequer. So, it's a very tense scenario where, it's forever about walking the tightrope. I'd hope that the vaccines would have ended that walk across the tightrope, and some countries would already be on the other side. But that's not the case yet, because the effectiveness of the vaccines has been weakened slightly by the new variants. And secondly, of course, there are people who decide not to be vaccinated. And there's still quite a heavy percentage in Europe and America that haven't been vaccinated. And then you've got countries like Australia, which basically shut themselves down and did an enormous amount to minimize the number of cases. But of course, they're in a very fragile place at the moment. They just get a few cases in Sydney and then they close the whole state down. So Australia is in a very fragile state, and at some stage they're going to have to open up their country again to foreign visitors, but who knows when. So you have to balance those different scenarios. And I would say that the times we've been through since the beginning of 2020 were about the same as what people went through in the last century with the two great world wars. We've never had anything like it. And one of the things of the human psyche is that it won't last long. I mean, if you read history books, people will tell you that when war was declared in 1914, most people thought it would be over by Christmas. And it wasn't. It went on till 1918. And similarly, this pandemic could go on for much longer. Which brings me to the scenarios for South Africa. And there's one rule of the game which we absolutely mention in this book, which is the nature of work has changed forever. In the last century, big business created hundreds of thousands of jobs. You know, after you went to school, or if you were lucky enough to go to university, you waved your CV around, you got a job. But automation and robots and all the stuff that has happened in business processes mean that big business is no longer the major creator of jobs. We actually quote in this book the Small Business Federation in America, where 2/3 of the jobs being created today in America are in small and micro business. There's been a fundamental change in employment around the world. And it's those countries that promote entrepreneurship and small business creation that have the lowest unemployment rates. And that is a flag or rule of the game that we say South Africa cannot ignore. It's beyond our control. So if we want to create millions of jobs in the future, we're going to have to create millions of new businesses. And that's where the focus has to be. And as we say, in just before we get to the scenarios, I'd just like to read this. South Africa right now stands at an economic crossroads after years of corruption and state capture, combined with the disruptive impact of COVID-19. The coffers are virtually empty, and this is unlikely to change anytime soon. We are at a tipping point where the path we take in the immediate future could define our future for decades. And so we offer two scenarios for South Africa. The first one we call people's economy. And what we say is this: we want to convey the message that the work achieved by Nelson Mandela and others before and after the dawn of South Africa's democracy constitutes unfinished business. In the sequel to the watershed event that was the 1994 general election, the country now achieves economic freedom for all as a necessary complement to political freedom. The government creates an inclusive economy with a new generation of young entrepreneurs at the helm. That is the most critical thing about the people's economy scenario. I did a debate back in 2016 with Julius Malema at the Cape Sun Hotel for a dinner. And I said to him, I'm an economic freedom fighter too, Julius. It's just that my definition of economic freedom is different to yours. I want all individuals in this country to be economically free, to be able to start their own businesses. And in fact, we quote a savvy Peruvian economist in this book called Hernando de Soto, who says that is the key to a country's success, is bringing the informal sector out of the shadows and making it part of the mainstream economy. The second scenario, cautionary tale, goes like this. Here, South Africa experiences rising popular anger caused by an economy that is stagnant, exclusive, and cursed by a dismally high unemployment rate. This leads to further disunity and widespread violence, with a possible endpoint of total anarchy in the chain of causation. That was written well before the dreadful looting and destruction that we saw last week. But obviously, the destruction was a real flag for this scenario. And so this is a very, very important moment in our history. And I feel very, very strongly that Cyril, and we also mention that in the book, that Cyril has to put together a council, an entrepreneurship council, the same way that he has a coronavirus council, which discusses the strategic decision on restrictions and how we should live and which state of lockdown we should be in. We need another council made up of CEOs who founded businesses, people like Adrian Moore who founded Discovery, so that they can use that knowledge to advise the president of the best way to go about stimulating small business in this country. And then the president should actually go on television once a month and say, this is the number of new businesses we've created. This is what we're doing in this area and how we're trying to create micro enterprise in rural areas. We should probably have e-stock exchanges in all the major cities in this country so that you can launch your business by doing an equivalent to eBay, by putting it on a particular website. We need the banks to get together to look at creating a proper micro lending network around this country. We need every big business to dedicate around 20% of its supply chain to nurturing small businesses. Those are the kind of things that will save us. And so, we feel that this has got to be led from the front by Cyril. Obviously, the destruction and looting was the negative side of last week, but the coming together and the cleanup operation and South Africans showing that they can work as a team when you have such an incredible crisis. It shows that actually there's a lot of energy that comes from the ground up. And the whole point of the people's economy scenario is that you use that energy to transform our economy into one that is inclusive and that we can be as proud of as our political democracy. So we think these two scenarios, people's economy versus cautionary tale, are exactly the ones that people should keep in mind. And of course, you should be thinking, what can I do? What can I do to make this happen? What can I do to make sure that the powder keg that's exploded last week, that actually it's not refilled with explosive powder, instead of which it's reloaded with hope, and it's reloaded with a determined resolution not to allow last week ever to happen again. So yeah, this book has come out at a particularly fraught moment, but we do feel people should think the future, like we say in this book. So thank you very much for allowing me to address you this morning, and I'm prepared to take any questions. Thank you.
Perfect, Clem, thank you very much, and some really interesting insights. So I would like to say to everyone listening in, if you would like to put questions onto the message group, we'll do our best to answer them. I mean, one of the things that stands out for me straight away is that South Africa is not unique. We tend as South Africans to get negative about what's going on now, but interesting you say that these are scenarios that are playing out all over the world. So I think a message that this is really a global problem and not just unique to South Africa. Clem, maybe a couple of questions while we're seeing if any come through. So your views on the current, rioting and striking and looting in South Africa. This was not necessarily a politically driven, instigated scenario. This is something that you probably predicted that was going to happen for some time because of the inequality in our countries. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And I noticed, in Alec Hogg's Biz Newsletter, there was a person who contributed today who said exactly that. Yes, there were probably political opportunists in there, but we have fundamentally got a very unequal economy. It's measured by Gini coefficients, and we have one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world measuring inequality. And, there's so much talent in this country that I've seen for creating business. It's just that they're not given the sort of attractive circumstances that you need to get your township business out into the mainstream economy. And we produce some incredible entrepreneurs. I mean, I always mention Elon Musk, who's now the second richest man in the world. He went to Pretoria Boys High. And Siyabulela Zuza, who's absolutely brilliant engineer, who designed a new rocket fuel, which was more energy intensive than anything NASA has produced, and has a minor planet named after him. How many people know about this young guy called Siyabulela Zuza? We've got these incredible entrepreneurs. It's time to put total focus on them because they are the future of South Africa. The politicians are there to provide the playing field. And I must just mention this, when I was shown around the Central Party School in Beijing, because very few foreigners are allowed into the school, it was interesting that there were no slogans by Mao Zedong on the walls of the lecture rooms. They'd replaced them with Deng Xiaoping. And when I asked one of the professors why, he said, Deng did two things for us. He said, we've got to concentrate on our infrastructure, which is part of our responsibility as government, to build new roads, new airports, new everything in China. But the second thing is we've got to allow Chinese people to create wealth for themselves. And that's why China's broken through, is for that second reason. And that's why Russia and Venezuela and Cuba are languishing, because they are stuck in the old groove of communism and socialism. And somehow we've got to persuade the ANC to move away from this old-fashioned model and to create economic freedom, but in the way that I've been talking about in the people's economy scenario.
Thank you, Clem. We're getting lots of questions around small business. So from Christy Carr and Ferguson Langenhoven, Ronnie Carpenter and a few others. And really, there are a few questions. What else can we do for small businesses? So you've mentioned, Cyril putting together a team of CEOs and entrepreneurs to advise him. One question is, are there any signs of that happening? And do you think that will happen? And then what are the main barriers to entrepreneurship? There's a lot of regulation. What else can we do to encourage and stimulate small business in this country? And are there any signs that this may happen from Cyril Ramaphosa or the ruling party?
Yeah, well, at the moment, we haven't got anything which has been really laid out in terms of a plan for recovery. I mean, there are some old plans, and yes, they had very good objectives attached to them, and certainly Cyril has talked in very friendly terms about small business. But I really think this is the moment to come up with the kind of specific things I'm talking about around, capital, because we all know if you start a business, you need capital, and it's quite difficult to get capital in this country. So we've got to look at the kind of crowdfunding techniques that have been used by the internet we have to look at, as I said, the kind of micro lending things that are going on in places like Bangladesh. It's got a brilliant micro lending bank in Bangladesh. You know, we've obviously got to look at how small businesses can make businesses, big businesses, aware of what they do so that they can become part of the supply chain of big business. I mean, the Japanese economy is run on a dual logic model where a big company like Toyota assembles the final car, but all the components are manufactured by small businesses in Japan. Here, Anglo-American, my company, in the 1990s, we set up a scheme called Zemeli, where we identified products we use underground that could be manufactured by small business. And we actually got entrepreneurs in the community to do just that. We helped them, and it turned out to be a big success. Some of the businesses actually went and got other clients. Those are the kind of things that we're going to have to do in South Africa, which is very different to what we're doing now, because we are still operating in an exclusive economy. And franchising becomes a very, very important tool, because the great thing about franchises is that, you know, they diminish the risk for a new business owner because they're part of an established brand. So, you know, I can go on, but I much prefer a group of, you know, guys who are current CEOs and understand what it's like to found business, to put together the sort of top 20 action points.
Great stuff. Thank you. Some good insights. Clem, we're getting lots of questions around the future of politics and scenarios in politics in South Africa. So what are the chances, in your view, that the ANC and the ruling party can actually deliver on some of this? I certainly back Cyril as a really good guy, but I think he's in a tough position right now. And what are your views on the scenarios for the 2022 ANC elective conference, and what could happen in the politics of this country, and what are some of the flags that we should be looking out for in the political landscape?
Yeah, the answer is I don't know. I can't answer you on this question because I'm not a political pundit with inside knowledge of the ANC. The only thing I know is that the NEC is the sort of supreme body within the ANC, and therefore Cyril is obviously always at risk of being recalled, like Thabo Mbeki was, and therefore he's forever having to think about, you know, what his position and what support he has within the ANC, and so I guess that's why we see him in sometimes weighing things up in a way that people would like, straightforward action. I have no idea where the sort of different factions are in the ANC, but thank heavens this last week it would appear that those factions opposing Cyril, and particularly those associated with Jacob Zuma, our previous president, failed if they treated last week's looting as an opportunity to try and unseat Cyril.
Great, thank you very much. A really interesting question from Helene van der Poel. And I think one of the positive trends that we've seen out of these strikes is actually individual communities taking ownership. So we're taking ownership to protect their malls, to organize security clusters, in parts of the country, before this, taking ownership of fixing potholes and, maintaining their own livelihoods and surroundings and communities. Do you have any insights into how do we harness that power and spirit of communities to actually work with governments and improve South Africa?
Well, it's going to be the communities themselves, like last week in the cleanup. It wasn't somebody from outside. It was the communities themselves saying, we got to do this. And, I guess that's one of the things I like about America as opposed to Europe, is America is much more of a community-driven country than Europe is. Europe kind of Europeans look up to their national leaders to do something for them. Americans just get on with it in whatever state they're in, And yeah, I feel that, you know, we've got to have that kind of spirit here, that communities just obviously do as best they can to you know, get out of the, you know, the terrible circumstances that they got into last week, where they were affected. And what is nice is we're seeing teamwork between the authorities and between the private sector and between ordinary people. So, you know, as I said, it really showed the good side of South Africa, that we can operate as a team.
Thank you, Clem. There are a couple of interesting questions that we'll maybe leave it to sort of two more questions, and then we can start to wrap up. Clem, there are a few questions around BE and Black economic empowerment. Obviously, elements of that are really important for, you know, bigger businesses, supporting enterprise development and smaller businesses. A really good question around big businesses in South Africa. Should they create space for SMEs, particularly in townships? You have the likes of the Pick and Pay crowding out spaza shops. But maybe just in general, you know, what are your views on Black economic empowerment, the current guidelines for businesses, and how else can big businesses support creation of small businesses in South Africa?
You know, as I said, I don't know what Pick and Pay and Checkers and the others should do, because they're incredibly well-run businesses, and it's why malls are so spectacularly popular in Africa, but in South Africa. But, you know, as far as Black economic empowerment is concerned, I can understand why it has been such a priority, because we have to create that inclusive economy. And you know, we've managed to do it inside Anglo-American. We've got some incredibly able Black people in all our mines and everywhere. So, you know, it's a question of implementing the policy in a way that really benefits your business. So I've got no problem with that. But in terms of entrepreneurship and small business, you know, I'm well aware that it's South Africans of all creeds and colors who've been facing tough times during this pandemic, and therefore I want the kind of entrepreneurship revolution to be a non-racial one. You know, we shouldn't talk about Black, white, colored, or any kind of empowerment. We should just talk about an entrepreneurship revolution in South Africa, and make it happen.
Thank you, Clem. And that's certainly we need a non-racial entrepreneurial revolution. And that was one of the positives that I took out some of this, you know, rioting and striking and communities coming together, you know, to protect them all was it wasn't based on lines of race in many cases. And I think that's a positive for our country, when we can work together and not along, you know, be divided along lines of race. Clem, maybe a last question to wrap up. It seems like, you know, you painted two scenarios for South Africa, and it seems like we're more along the road of a cautionary tale scenario right now in South Africa. What are the probabilities and likelihood of getting out of that and into people's economy? And then maybe leave us with, on a positive note, you know, after that, and then we can wrap it up.
No, I in the immediate aftermath of the looting, I must say I raised the probability of the cautionary tale scenario. But then I witnessed the pushback by communities, and incredible to see that. And obviously, I'm going to watch what happens this week and next week, and you know, to see whether we can get all those malls back operating over the next few months. But you know, I guess that I give a fairly low chance at the moment to the cautionary tale scenario, but and a higher odds to the people's economy. But what is absolutely essential for the people's economy to materialize is for all of us to participate in making it happen. That is number one condition for it happening. And thank heavens I have enough faith in South African people that they can make it happen.
Thank you very much, Clem. I think that's a really, really good note to end it off on, and a positive, in that it's about all of us South Africans using our spirit and coming together and all of us making it happen.